Family threw me out when I was jobless. 5 years later, they showed up and said, "We're taking this house. My name is Hazel. I'm 31 years old, and this is my story. It's not an easy one to tell, but it's mine, and I need to share it." The knock came just after sunset. It wasn't a friendly knock, the kind a neighbor makes when they're dropping off mail. It was hard and impatient. 3 sharp hits on the solid oak door that made my stomach drop into my shoes. I was in the kitchen, washing a dinner plate, and the sound echoed through the quiet cottage. The old house was sturdy, but that knock felt like it could shake the foundation. I dried my hands on a towel, my heart beating a little too fast. I wasn't expecting anyone. My boyfriend Ryan was out of town for the night at a book fair, and my friends always called first. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, just letting whoever it was think I wasn't home. But a small light was on in the living room, a soft yellow glow against the darkening blue of the evening. They knew someone was here. Taking a slow breath, I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. I saw the familiar shape of a man's overcoat, dark and wet from the evening drizzle. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew who it was. My hand trembled as I unlocked the deadbolt. The click sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. I opened the door. My father, Thomas, stood on my porch, rain dripping from the brim of his coat onto the welcome mat my grandmother had laid there decades ago. He looked older, his face etched with lines of bitterness I knew all too well. He wasn't looking at me with the warmth a father should have. He was looking past me, into my home, with an expression that was appraising, cold, and possessive. "You're alone, Hazel," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a calculated fact. No husband, no children. We're taking this house. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. His words hung in the damp air, so blunt and cruel they almost didn't feel real. Behind him, another figure stepped out of the shadows. My brother, Jason. He had the same entitled smirk he'd worn his entire life, the one that always made me feel small. He gave me a lazy, mocking little wave. And then my mother, Linda, emerged from behind them both. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the house, her expression a mixture of greed and nervous excitement. She was clutching a cardboard box, the kind you get from a moving company. On the side, in thick black marker, she had written, "Master Bedroom." The sight of that box, so premeditated and smug, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold night air. This wasn't a spontaneous visit. This was an invasion. It was planned. They had come here with a purpose, with boxes already labeled, as if the outcome was already decided. The same family who had thrown me out onto the street when I had nothing, when I was jobless and begging for a single month's help, now stood on my doorstep. They wanted to take everything I had spent the last 5 years building. Every wall I had painted, every floorboard I had polished, every bit of peace I had painstakingly earned. Something inside me should have snapped. I should have screamed. I should have slammed the door in their faces, cursed them for their audacity, for their bottomless cruelty. I should have cried, my body shaking with the rage and the hurt that was bubbling just beneath the surface. But I did none of those things. Instead, a strange and powerful calm washed over me. It was a cold, clear stillness, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and leveled everything in its path. I had already weathered their worst storm once before. I had survived it. This was just a drizzle in comparison. I looked at my father, then at my smirking brother, and finally at my mother, who still refused to meet my eyes. I let the silence stretch, letting them stand there in the rain, their intentions laid bare. I watched the confidence on my father's face begin to flicker, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He expected tears. He expected a fight. He didn't expect this unnerving quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't betray a single emotion. I just looked them right in the eye, one by one, and held their gaze. Then slowly and deliberately, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. They thought this was the end of my story. They were wrong. This was the end of theirs. I grew up in a small, suffocating suburb in Ohio, the kind of place where every house on the street looked the same. The lawns were all perfectly manicured, the hedges trimmed into neat green boxes, and the cars in the driveways were always washed. From the outside, we were the perfect family living in the perfect neighborhood. But inside our house, behind the polished front door, love was a currency, and I was always broke. It was conditional, handed out for achievements that fit a very specific mold, a mold I could never seem to squeeze myself into. My father, Thomas, was a numbers man. He was a branch manager for a large insurance company, and he ran our family like he ran his office, with an obsessive need for control and a clear bottom line. Everything was a transaction. Good grades were an investment. Obedience was a requirement. Emotions were liabilities, messy variables that couldn't be entered into a spreadsheet. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it didn't reach his eyes. His praise was rare and always tied to something practical, something that would look good on a college application or a future resume. My mother, Linda, was the architect of our family's public image. She cared deeply about what the neighbors thought, what her friends at the country club said, what the family Christmas card looked like. Her main concern was appearances, not feelings. If I was sad, her first question wasn't "what's wrong?" but "did anyone see you crying?" She floated through our home like a ghost in a floral apron, rearranging decorative pillows and ignoring the silent, heavy tension that filled every room. She wasn't cruel in the loud, aggressive way my father could be. Her neglect was quieter, a soft, smothering blanket of indifference. And then there was my brother Jason. He was 2 years older than me, and from the day he was born, he was their masterpiece. He was the sun, and I was just a pale, forgotten moon orbiting him. Jason was everything they wanted. He got straight A's without trying. He was the captain of the debate team, and he got a full scholarship to a prestigious university. He was the future of the family, a phrase my father used so often it felt like Jason's official title. He knew he was the favorite, and he wore that knowledge like a crown, treating me with a casual disdain that cut deeper than any insult. He was the golden boy, and I was just the quiet one, the afterthought. Me? I was Hazel, the girl who liked to draw in the margins of her notebooks instead of taking perfect notes. The girl who preferred the library to the loud, competitive world of school sports. I was the one who didn't fit into their pre-approved boxes. My dreams were quiet, colorful things that I learned to keep to myself. When I was 16, I got my first job stocking shelves at the local Target. The work was boring. My back ached at the end of every shift, and my hands were always dry from the cardboard boxes. But I loved it. I loved the feeling of my own paycheck, the crisp bills that I earned myself. I didn't spend it on clothes or makeup like other girls my age. Every single dollar went into an old coffee tin I kept hidden under my bed. On the side, I'd written in Sharpie, "College Fund." That tin was my secret hope, my escape plan. One evening at dinner, feeling a rare flicker of courage, I decided to share my dream with them. Jason was going on and on about his pre-law internship, and my father was nodding along, practically beaming. When there was a lull in the conversation, I cleared my throat. "I've been thinking about what I want to study in college," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My father looked at me, raising an eyebrow as if surprised I had a thought worth sharing. "Oh? I want to study graphic design," I said, a little louder this time. "I love to draw and I'm good with computers. I think I could make a career out of it." My father scoffed. It was a short, sharp, dismissive sound that instantly withered my confidence. "That's not a career, Hazel," he said, setting his fork down with a definitive clink. "That's a hobby. It's something you do in your spare time. You need a practical skill, something stable, like accounting or human resources." I looked to my mother for support, a desperate, silent plea. She just gave me a tight, placid smile, the one she used when a guest said something slightly inappropriate. "Maybe you'll marry someone practical, dear," she said, as if my entire future depended on a man's sensible career choice. Jason just snickered into his napkin. My dream, which had felt so bright and real just moments before, was reduced to a silly, childish fantasy. A hobby, something to be done in my spare time. I felt a hot sting behind my eyes, but I refused to cry. I would not give them the satisfaction. I just nodded, picked up my fork, and pushed the food around on my plate for the rest of the meal, the silence in my own head screaming louder than any words. That was the night I stopped showing them my dreams. I packed them away, folded them up small, and tucked them into that coffee tin along with my dollar bills. I learned to be invisible in my own home, to navigate around their expectations without ever challenging them directly. I was the girl who never measured up, and I finally understood that no matter what I did, I never would. The only thing I could do was save up and get out. The day I turned 18, I packed 2 suitcases and the coffee tin full of my Target earnings, and I left. There was no tearful goodbye, no family argument. It was just a quiet exit. I told them I was moving into a dorm at the local community college. My father just grunted and said, "Don't expect us to pay for it." My mother gave me a flimsy, one-armed hug and told me to make sure I ate enough vegetables. Jason didn't even bother to come downstairs. It was as if I were leaving for a weekend, not for good. The first few months were brutally hard. My dorm room felt less like a home and more like a concrete box. I attended classes during the day and worked double shifts at a diner at night. the smell of grease and burnt coffee clinging to my clothes and hair. I was always tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep never seemed to cure. I lived on instant noodles and the free toast my manager let me take at the end of my shifts. But for all the hardship, I felt a sense of freedom I had never known before. This life, as difficult as it was mine. I was paying my own tuition. I was buying my own food. Every small, exhausted step I took was a step I took on my own. My family never called. They didn't come to visit. On holidays, I'd get a generic card in the mail signed by my mother, with no personal note inside. It was clear they saw my independence not as a strength, but as a rejection of them, and they were punishing me for it with silence. The only person who cared, the only thread connecting me to a past that didn't feel painful, was Grandma Dorothy. She was my mother's mom, but she was nothing like her daughter. Grandma Dorothy was warm and loud and stubborn. She smelled like soil and chamomile tea, and her hands were rough from a lifetime of working in her garden. She called me every single Sunday without fail. "How are you holding up, kiddo?" she'd ask, her voice crackling over the cheap phone I kept. "I'm okay, Grandma," I'd say, trying to sound more cheerful than I felt. But she could always hear the truth. "You've got my stubborn streak, Hazel," she'd tell me, her voice firm. "I see it in you. Don't you let them shrink you. You were born to take up space in this world." Her words were a lifeline. During summer breaks, when other students went on vacation or back to their comfortable family homes, I drove the 2 hours to her small cottage. The house was old and charming, with a slightly crooked porch and climbing roses that threatened to take over the entire front wall. She'd built most of it herself after my grandpa passed away, a feat my own father dismissed as unladylike and reckless. To me, it was a monument to her strength. Those summers saved me. We'd spend our days in the sun, working side by side. I helped her paint the fences a bright, cheerful white. We planted rows of tomatoes and basil, our hands caked in rich, dark earth. She taught me how to fix a leaky faucet, how to patch a hole in a plaster wall, and how to use her ancient, rattling desktop computer to balance her finances. She'd watch me sketch in my notebook, and unlike my parents, she never called it a hobby. "You've got an eye for beauty, Hazel," she'd say, tapping one of my drawings. "That's a gift." One afternoon, we were sitting on her porch swing, sipping iced tea after a long day of pulling weeds. She was quiet for a long time, just watching the bees buzz around her rose bushes. "You know," she said finally, her gaze distant, "when your grandpa died, everyone told me to sell this land. Said a woman on her own couldn't manage it. Your father especially. He wanted me to move into one of those sterile retirement homes." She let out a dry chuckle. "I told him I'd rather live in a tent. So I learned. I learned how to lay bricks. I learned how to wire a lamp. I built this place with my own 2 hands, brick by stubborn brick." She turned to look at me then, her blue eyes sharp and clear. "They see a house, Hazel, but I see every mistake, every success, every lesson I learned. It's more than wood and nails. It's proof that I could do it myself. I didn't know it then, sitting on that swing, the sun warming my face. I thought she was just telling me a story about her past, but she wasn't. She was showing me how to build a life. She was giving me the blueprint. Independence wasn't the same as loneliness. Independence was a foundation, solid and real, that no one could ever take away from you. She was teaching me how to lay my own bricks. By the time I was 27, I had started to build a life I was proud of. After graduating from community college, I'd hustled, taking on any small graphic design freelance gig I could find. I designed logos for local bakeries, flyers for community events, and menus for small restaurants. Eventually, I landed a full-time job as a web designer for a small but promising marketing agency downtown. I wasn't rich by any means, but I had my own small apartment, I could pay my bills on time, and I was doing work that I loved. For the first time, I felt like a real adult. I was standing on my own 2 feet, on a foundation I had built myself, just like Grandma Dorothy taught me. Then, one Tuesday morning, everything fell apart. I walked into the office to find our manager, a man who was usually cheerful and loud, standing by the door with a grim expression. The air was thick with a strange, heavy silence. He called us all into the conference room and delivered the news bluntly. The agency's biggest client had pulled out unexpectedly, and as a result, the company was insolvent. They were shutting down, effective immediately. There was no severance, no warning, just a cardboard box to pack up our personal belongings, and a generic letter wishing us the best in our future endeavors. I walked out of that building in a daze, clutching my box with my favorite coffee mug and a few design books. The city streets, usually so full of energy, felt hostile and overwhelming. The foundation I had so carefully built had crumbled into dust in the span of 15 minutes. Panic set in over the next few weeks. My savings were meager, barely enough to cover 1 month's rent. I spent every waking hour polishing my portfolio and sending out job applications. But the market was tight. The rejections started trickling in, and then they stopped altogether. I was met with a wall of silence. The due date for my rent loomed closer and closer, a dark cloud on the horizon. Finally, with only a few days to spare and my bank account nearly empty, I swallowed my pride. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. My hand shook as I dialed the number I hadn't called in years. My father answered on the second ring, his voice clipped and impatient. "Thomas Thompson, Dad." "It's Hazel," I said, my voice small and shaky. There was a long pause on the other end. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone flat, devoid of any warmth. I took a deep breath and forced the words out. I lost my job. The whole company shut down. I just need a little help, just for 1 month, to cover my rent until I can find something new. "I'll pay you back, I promise," he sighed. It was a long, heavy, theatrical sigh, the sound of a man burdened by an immense inconvenience. It was the sound he made when the stock market dipped or when Jason got a B+ instead of an A. It was the sound of my desperation being weighed and found wanting. "Actions have consequences, Hazel," he said, his voice cold and distant, like he was reading from a script. "You chose this path. You wanted to be independent." Before I could even respond, my mother's voice cut in on the extension, sharp and defensive. "We're paying for Jason's business school, Hazel. It's very expensive. We don't have extra money for this. You'll have to figure it out. Figure it out." The 2 words she had always used to wash her hands of any problem I ever had. The line went silent for a second, and then I heard a sharp click. They had hung up on me. I stood there in my empty apartment, the dead phone pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I couldn't breathe. The rejection was so complete, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. That night, a storm rolled in, and the rain began to lash against my window. Driven by a desperation I couldn't control, I got in my old beat-up car and drove to their house. The house I grew up in. I stood on their porch, the rain soaking through my thin coat, and knocked on the door. It felt like an eternity before the porch light flickered on and the door opened, but only halfway, still secured by the chain lock. My father's face appeared in the gap, his expression hard as stone. "I told you, Hazel," he said, his voice low and angry. "We can't help you." "Please, Dad," I begged, my voice breaking. I hated the sound of it, the pathetic weakness in my tone. "I have nowhere else to go. Just for a few nights. I'll sleep on the couch." He just stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. I could see the warm, dry living room behind him, the television flickering. I could smell the scent of my mother's pot roast. I was standing in the cold, wet dark, begging to be led into a life that had no room for me. "You made your choices," he said, his voice flat and final. "Live with them." He shut the door. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a heavy, definitive thud. I stood there on the porch for a long time, the rain plastering my hair to my face, my body shaking from the cold and the shock. The lights in the house stayed on, but the door never opened again. That was the night I stopped being their daughter. That was the night I truly became an orphan. The month that followed was the longest, most humiliating month of my life. After my landlord taped an eviction notice to my door, I packed what little I owned into my beat-up Honda Civic. My clothes, my portfolio, and the old coffee tin, which was now empty, were stuffed into the back seat and the trunk. My car became my home, my closet, and my dining room. My whole world was confined to that small metal box. I spent most of my days in a painful, mind-numbing routine. I would park in the far corner of the 24-hour Walmart parking lot, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible, my heart pounding every time a security car drove by. At night, I would recline the driver's seat as far as it would go and try to sleep, covering myself with my coat and a thin blanket. Sleep never came easily. Every noise, every pair of headlights sweeping across my windows made me jump. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. Mornings were the worst. I would wake up with a stiff neck, cold and cramped, the condensation from my breath fogging up the inside of the windows. My first stop was always a 24-hour gym. I had just enough money to keep my cheap monthly membership active. The gym was my sanctuary. It was the only place I could shower, the hot water a luxury that felt almost sinful. I would stand under the spray for as long as I could, letting it wash away the grime, and for a few minutes, the feeling of being homeless. I'd brush my teeth in the public sink, avoiding eye contact with the other women, terrified they could see the desperation on my face. Food was whatever I could afford from the dollar menu at McDonald's. I ate burgers and fries in my car, the smell of grease permanently clinging to the upholstery. I used the free Wi-Fi at the gas station or the public library to send out job applications. I sent out dozens, then hundreds. I tailored every cover letter, polished every line of my resume, but my phone remained silent. The hope I started with began to curdle into a bitter, gnawing despair. I felt invisible, like I had been erased from the world. No one was looking for me. No one even knew I was gone. One afternoon, sitting in a corner booth of a coffee shop, nursing a single cup of black coffee for over 3 hours just to use their Wi-Fi, I finally hit my limit. The rejections, the silence, the constant hunger and fear, it all came crashing down on me at once. I buried my face in my hands, and for the first time since my father had shut the door on me, I started to cry. Silent, racking sobs that shook my entire body. "Hazel? Is that you?" The voice was soft, hesitant. I looked up, quickly wiping my eyes. A woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile was standing by my table. It was Carla, an old friend from my community college days. We hadn't seen each other in years. I felt a hot flush of shame. I probably looked terrible. My hair was a mess, my clothes were wrinkled from being slept in, and my eyes were red and swollen. "Carla," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Hi." She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't look at me with pity. She just pulled up a chair and sat down. "I haven't seen you in forever. What have you been up to?" The kindness in her voice broke down the last of my defenses. The whole story just spilled out of me. The job, the eviction, the phone call to my parents, living in my car. I told her everything. She listened patiently, her expression growing more and more concerned. When I was finished, she just reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "Okay," she said, her voice firm and clear. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to finish your coffee. Then you're going to come with me. We have a spare bedroom. It's yours for as long as you need it." I just stared at her, speechless. I tried to protest, to tell her I couldn't impose, but she waved it away. "Nonsense," she said. "That's what friends are for." Her spare bedroom saved my life. The simple act of sleeping in a real bed, under a warm comforter, felt like the greatest luxury in the world. Carla and her boyfriend, David, treated me not as a charity case, but as a guest. They shared their meals with me, let me do my laundry, and most importantly, they gave me a safe space to breathe. One evening, David, who I learned owned a small but successful design studio, saw me working on my portfolio on my laptop. He came over and looked over my shoulder. "This is your work?" he asked, pointing to a website I had designed for a nonprofit. "Yeah," I said, feeling nervous under his professional gaze. He was quiet for a few minutes, clicking through my different projects. I held my breath, expecting criticism or polite dismissal. Instead, he turned to me, a serious look on his face. "You've got talent, Hazel," he said. "Real talent. I've been looking for a junior designer to help with some overflow projects. The pay isn't great to start, but it's something. Can you start Monday?" Tears welled up in my eyes again, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of shame or despair. They were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable relief. It was a flicker of light at the end of a long, dark, terrifying tunnel. That night, tucked into the safe, warm bed in Carla's spare room, I cried myself to sleep. Not from pity, but from the profound gratitude of being seen. Someone had finally seen me. Life after moving out of Carla's spare room was a slow and steady climb. Working for David gave me more than just a paycheck. It gave me a routine, a purpose, and a chance to hone the skills I was passionate about. I poured myself into my work, grateful for every project, every challenge. For the first time since my world had collapsed, I felt a sense of stability. I lived simply, saving every dollar I could, rebuilding the emergency fund that my family's cruelty had forced me to drain. My tiny studio apartment was my haven. It was a space that was entirely mine, where no one could make me feel small or unwelcome. I was laying new bricks, one by one, on a foundation that felt shaky but was, at least, my own. I focused on the present, deliberately pushing thoughts of my family into a locked box in the back of my mind. The pain was still there, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my daily life, but I refused to let it define me. I had survived. That had to be enough. A year passed like this, quiet and diligent. Then, one Thursday afternoon as I was finalizing a website layout, my phone buzzed. The number was from my grandmother's area code, but I didn't recognize it. A flicker of anxiety went through me, a familiar dread that any call from that part of the state meant trouble. I let it go to voicemail, but the caller immediately dialed back. This time I answered. "Hello? Is this Hazel Thompson?" a woman's voice asked. It was soft and sounded worried. "Yes, this is she." "Hazel, dear, this is Margaret Allen. I live next door to your grandmother, Dorothy." My heart seized. "Margaret, is everything okay?" I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this, she said, her voice full of genuine sympathy. Dorothy had a fall this morning. The paramedics just took her to St. Mary's Hospital. She's conscious, but she asked me to call you. The world around me went silent. The vibrant colors on my computer screen seemed to fade to gray. I'm on my way, I said, my voice coming out as a choked whisper. I hung up the phone and stared blankly at the wall. My grandmother, the only person who had ever been my champion, my safe harbor. David must have seen the look on my face. He was at my desk in an instant, his expression full of concern. Hazel, what is it? My grandmother, I managed to say, the words thick in my throat. She's in the hospital. I have to go. Go, he said immediately, no questions asked. Don't even think about work. Just go. Let me know if you need anything. Anything at all. The 3-hour drive was a blur of asphalt and memories. I replayed every Sunday phone call, every summer I'd spent with her, the smell of her rose garden, the feel of her rough, calloused hands holding mine. She was tough, my grandmother, stubborn and fiercely independent, but she wasn't invincible, and the thought that I might lose her, the last real piece of family I had, was a terrifying weight on my chest. I drove faster than I should have, praying to a God I wasn't even sure I believed in. I found her in a small, sterile room on the 3rd floor. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, a network of tubes and wires connecting her to beeping machines. Her skin was pale, and there was a dark bruise on her temple, but when she saw me standing in the doorway, her eyes lit up with that familiar, fiery spark. You came, she breathed, a weak but genuine smile spreading across her lips. I rushed to her bedside, taking her hand. It felt cool and fragile. Of course I came, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Margaret called me. What happened? Are you okay? Met the floor and the floor won, she said with a flash of her old humor. Her smile faded slightly. The doctor says I cracked a hip, and they found other things. It's not good, kiddo. I felt the floor drop out from under me. What do you mean, other things? She just looked at me, her eyes full of a sad, resigned wisdom. My time's about up, Hazel, and that's okay. I've had a good long run. Tears I hadn't realized were there began to stream down my face. No, Grandma, don't say that. You're strong. You'll get through this. She squeezed my hand. I am strong, and that's why I know when a fight is over. Her gaze shifted to the small table beside her bed. There's an envelope there. For you. I picked it up. Inside was a set of keys and a thick sheaf of legal documents. I looked at her, my expression full of confusion. The cottage is yours, she said, her voice quiet but firm. The house, the land, my savings, it's all taken care of. It's all in your name. Grandma, I can't. Yes, you can, she interrupted, her voice gaining a bit of its old strength. I'm not leaving you with a burden. I'm leaving you with a foundation, a place that's yours, that no one can ever take from you. You build a life there, Hazel. You hear me? You fill that house with happiness. You promise me. I was sobbing now, my head bowed over our joined hands. I promise, Grandma, I whispered. I promise. She held my hand until she drifted off to sleep. I sat with her, through the night, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, listening to the steady beeping of the machines that were keeping her here. In the quiet, early hours of the morning, just as the first light was beginning to touch the sky, the beeping stopped. She was gone. My anchor was gone. The funeral was a hollow, painful exercise. My parents and Jason were there, their grief a poorly staged performance. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes and accepted condolences with a tragic sigh. My father stood stiffly, checking his watch every few minutes. They spoke to me in hushed, awkward tones, treating me like a distant relative they were obligated to acknowledge. Their presence felt like a violation of my own private, profound grief. The will reading took place the following week. We sat in a stuffy lawyer's office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and my family's greed. They sat across from me, a united front of entitlement, whispering to each other while they waited. They assumed everything would go to my mother. They were already talking about selling the property, about what they would do with the money. The lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, finally began to read. He went through a few small bequests, and then he cleared his throat and looked directly at me. And as to the remainder of my estate, he read, including my property at 142 Willow Lane, and all associated savings and checking accounts, I leave it all, in its entirety, to my beloved granddaughter, Hazel Thompson. The silence in the room was absolute. My father's face contorted, shifting from shock to pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. That's impossible, he roared. She was manipulated. That house belongs to this family. He turned his furious gaze on me. You did this. You poisoned an old woman against her own daughter. Years of fear and intimidation fell away in that moment. I looked at his red, angry face, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You want to talk about family? I said, my voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. You never visited her. You called her a burden. You wanted to put her in a home so you could sell her house years ago. I looked at my mother, whose face was ashen. You were her only child, and you couldn't be bothered to see her more than twice a year. I was there. I helped her in the garden. I listened to her stories. I held her hand when she died. I took the keys from my pocket, their weight solid and real in my palm. She didn't give me a house because I manipulated her. She gave me a home because she loved me. I turned and walked out of the office, leaving them sitting there, stunned and silent in their impotent fury. I didn't look back. I was walking, away from them for the last time, toward the foundation my grandmother had given me. The cottage was just as I remembered it, yet entirely different. Standing on the porch with the keys in my hand, I was no longer a visiting college student. I was the owner, the caretaker of my grandmother's legacy. The grief was a physical presence, a weight in the air of every room. For the first few days, I just existed within it. I wandered through the quiet spaces, running my hands over her worn armchair, looking at the faded photographs on the mantelpiece, and sleeping in her bed, wrapped in a quilt that still smelled faintly of her. The silence was profound, but it wasn't an empty silence. It felt watchful, expectant. After a week of mourning, a new feeling began to surface, a sense of purpose. My grandmother had given me a foundation, and it was my responsibility to build upon it. I started by clearing out the clutter, carefully packing away her most personal belongings into boxes for safekeeping. Then, I began the real work. The house was old and needed a lot of love, and I poured all my energy into it. It became my therapy, my way of processing my grief and channeling it into something productive, something beautiful. I started by stripping the dated floral wallpaper from the living room walls. Peeling it away in long, satisfying sheets felt like shedding an old skin. I spent days patching plaster and sanding the walls until they were perfectly smooth, painted them a soft, calming shade of gray that made the room feel bigger and brighter. Each brushstroke was a deliberate act of claiming the space as my own. I discovered a deep, unexpected satisfaction in manual labor. I fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen sink by watching a dozen online tutorials, a triumphant grin on my face when the dripping finally stopped. I sanded the old, scuffed hardwood floors by hand, my muscles screaming in protest, until the rich, warm grain of the original wood shone through. With every project I completed, I felt a piece of myself clicking back into place. I wasn't just fixing a house. I was rebuilding myself. The spare bedroom, with its large window overlooking the wild, beautiful chaos of the back garden, became my new office. I moved my desk and computer in, and for the first time, I had a dedicated space for my work. David had been wonderful, but I knew I couldn't work for him forever. Inspired by my grandmother's fierce independence, and armed with the small financial cushion she'd left me, I made the terrifying decision to start my own freelance design business. I spent weeks brainstorming names, designing a logo, and building a professional portfolio website. I called it Horizon Creative, a name that represented the future I was determined to build for myself. The beginning was slow and humbling. I took any job that came my way, no matter how small. I designed logos for local startups, flyers for community events, and menus for new cafes. My days were long, often stretching late into the night. The cottage was my sanctuary and my workplace, and the quiet rhythm of my life was punctuated only by the clicking of my keyboard and the deadlines I set for myself. But every invoice I sent, every check I deposited, was a validation. It was proof, just like my grandmother's house had been for her, that I could do it myself. Slowly, my reputation grew. My clients were happy, and they recommended me to others. One of those recommendations came from the owner of a new restaurant whose menu I had designed. He passed my name along to a friend of his, a man who owned a beloved independent bookstore downtown and needed a new website. His name was Ryan. He called me one afternoon, and his voice was so warm and genuine that it immediately put me at ease. We met for coffee to discuss the project. He had kind, intelligent eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and he spoke about his bookstore with a passion that was infectious. He wasn't just selling books. He was curating a community space. As I listened to him talk, I felt an immediate connection, a recognition of a kindred spirit who poured his heart into his work. Our professional relationship quickly blossomed into a friendship. After our meetings, we would find ourselves talking for hours about everything: books, art, our families, our dreams. I was hesitant to open up about my past, but there was a safety in his presence that made me feel I could tell him anything. One evening, sitting on the porch of the cottage, I told him the whole story. I told him about my parents, about the night in the rain, about living in my car. He listened without interruption, his expression full of empathy but not pity. When I finished, he just reached out and took my hand. "You are the strongest, most resilient person I have ever met, Hazel," he said, his voice quiet with awe. Dinners became dates. Dates blossomed into love. With Ryan, I learned what it felt like to be truly seen and valued for who I was. He loved the cottage and saw it not as old or flawed, but as a place full of character and history. He helped me in the garden, and together we tamed the wild chaos into neat rows of vegetables and flowers. He respected my independence, but was always there to offer his strength and support. He became my partner in every sense of the word. 2 years after I started Horizon Creative, my client list was full. I had a waiting list of projects and a steady, comfortable income. The cottage was no longer just my house. It was our home, filled with laughter, love, and the smell of old books and fresh paint. I had peace. I had a thriving business I had built from scratch. I had a partner who loved me unconditionally. I had taken the foundation my grandmother had given me and built a life that was more beautiful than anything I had ever dared to dream of. 5 years is a long time, long enough for deep wounds to scar over, for traumatic memories to fade into the background, becoming stories you tell instead of pains you feel. My life with Ryan in the cottage was peaceful and fulfilling. Horizon Creative was a success, and our relationship was a source of constant joy and stability. The past, with all its sharp edges, felt distant, like a chapter from someone else's life. I had everything I had ever wanted: a home, love, and a career I was proud of. I was happy. That happiness was shattered by a single email. It arrived on a Tuesday evening, unceremoniously dropping into my inbox between a client query and a promotional offer. The sender's name was Jason Thompson. A cold dread washed over me, a visceral reaction that tightened my chest and made my hands feel clammy. I hadn't heard a single word from him or from my parents since the day of the will reading 5 years ago. My first instinct was to delete it, to erase it before it could contaminate the peaceful world I had built. But a sliver of morbid curiosity, a foolish, deeply buried hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change, made me open it. The message was brief. "Hey Hazel, hope you're doing well. It's been too long. Mom, Dad, and I were thinking of driving out to see you and your place sometime next weekend. Let us know if that works." Jay, there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the past, just a casual, entitled assumption that they could reappear in my life whenever they pleased. I read it 3 times, a storm of conflicting emotions churning inside me. Anger was the first and strongest feeling, a hot wave of indignation at their audacity. But beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, the ghost of the little girl who had always craved their approval. Maybe this was their way of extending an olive branch. Maybe they wanted to see what I had accomplished and finally feel proud. Ryan came into the office and saw the look on my face. He read the email over my shoulder, and his arm came around me protectively. "You don't have to do this, Hazel," he said, his voice firm. "You don't owe them a single thing. You can just say no." "I know," I said, leaning back against him. "But what if it's a chance for closure? To just close that door for good, on my own terms." I was trying to convince myself as much as him. He was quiet for a moment. "If you think you're ready, then I'll be right beside you the entire time," he said, with a deep sense of foreboding. I typed back a short reply. "Saturday is fine." The days leading up to their visit were thick with tension. I found myself cleaning the house with a frantic energy, as if a perfectly polished floor or a dust-free shelf could act as armor against their inevitable judgment. Ryan watched me with concern, quietly helping me with chores, his steady presence a silent reassurance. By the time Saturday morning arrived, my stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. A sleek black SUV I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway right on time. It was far more luxurious than any car they had ever owned. As they got out, I saw that 5 years had changed them, but only on the surface. My father looked more prosperous, but also more severe. My mother was dressed impeccably, her smile as brittle and artificial as ever. Jason carried himself with an air of smug superiority that was all too familiar. The greetings were painfully awkward. My mother gave me a quick one-armed hug that was more of a pat, her eyes already scanning the house behind me. My father gave Ryan a curt, dismissive handshake. Jason just nodded at me. "So, this is the place," my father said, his voice holding a tone of appraisal, not admiration. He ran his hand along the porch railing. "Needs a new coat of paint." I bit my tongue. Ryan and I had painted it just last summer. I gave them the tour they had ostensibly come for. They moved through the rooms of my home like building inspectors, their comments a steady stream of veiled criticisms and assessments of value. They didn't see the love and hard work I had poured into every corner. They saw square footage and potential resale value. In my office, the hub of my successful business, Jason glanced at my top-of-the-line computer and said, "Cute little setup." We ended up in the kitchen. I moved on autopilot, making a pot of coffee I knew no one really wanted. As they sat down at my kitchen table, the atmosphere grew heavy. My father cleared his throat, assuming a position of authority, as if he were at the head of a boardroom table and not a guest in my home. "Hazel," he began, ignoring Ryan completely. "This place is far too big for just you. It's a lot of upkeep. Your mother and I have been discussing it. We're looking to retire soon, and this house would be a perfect place for us. It is, after all, family property." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer arrogance of his words. He spoke as if this were a foregone conclusion. My mother chimed in, her voice bright and chirpy. "I've always loved the garden, and the master bedroom gets such lovely morning sun. It would be perfect for us." "And Jason," she said, turning to my brother, "his latest business venture didn't work out, poor thing. He needs a quiet place to work on his next project. Your office would be just the thing for him." It all clicked into place. The expensive SUV, the sudden desire to reconnect. Jason had failed, and they needed a soft place for him to land. They needed my house. They had come here to announce my eviction. A sound escaped my throat. It started as a choked gasp and turned into a laugh. It was a cold, humorless sound. "You cannot be serious," I said, my voice trembling with disbelief and a rising tide of rage. My father's expression hardened. The facade of patriarchal benevolence dropped, revealing the cold, hard tyrant beneath. "I am perfectly serious. You wouldn't have this house if your grandmother hadn't died. It should have gone to your mother. By rights, it belongs to us." "Belongs to you?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Where was this sense of family ownership when I was begging you for help on your doorstep in the rain? You threw me away like I was garbage. You left me to be homeless. This house, this life, everything I have, I built it. Not you, me. You have no rights here. Do not take that tone with me," he thundered, slamming his hand on the table. "You are ungrateful. After everything we did for you." The rage inside me finally boiled over, burning away the last traces of the timid girl I used to be. I stood up, my hands flat on the table. "Get out," I said, my voice low and shaking with fury. "You can't talk to us like that." My mother gasped, clutching her pearls. "I can," I said, my voice gaining strength. "And I will. This is my house. You are not welcome here. Get out, now!" My father stood up, his face flushed with anger. He pointed a finger at me. "You will regret this, Hazel. This isn't over." I watched them storm out of my kitchen, their faces masks of indignation and thwarted greed. As they climbed back into their fancy SUV and sped away, I knew my father's last words weren't an empty threat. They were a promise. The weeks after their visit were shrouded in a thick fog of anxiety. The peace I had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a constant, nagging sense of dread. Every time a car slowed down on our street, my stomach would clench. I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times before bed, something I'd never done before. Ryan was my rock, constantly reassuring me that they were just trying to intimidate me, that there was nothing they could legally do. But I knew the kind of man my father was. His pride and his ego were everything to him, and I had wounded them both. He was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. In the midst of this tension, a major professional opportunity arose. I was invited to be a panelist at a prestigious design conference in Chicago. It was a huge honor, a recognition of the success I had built with Horizon Creative. In any other circumstances, I would have been ecstatic. Now, the thought of leaving the cottage even for a few days filled me with a deep unease. "We can't let them control our lives, Hazel," Ryan said one evening, seeing the worry on my face. "We can't hide in our own home. You earned this. You have to go." He was right. I couldn't let their threats shrink my world. We made arrangements for our neighbor Margaret to collect the mail and keep an eye on things, and with a lingering sense of apprehension, we flew to Chicago. The conference was a whirlwind of energy and creativity. Being surrounded by my peers, discussing the work I was so passionate about was invigorating. My panel went incredibly well. My story of building a business from the ground up resonated with many of the attendees. For 2 days, I managed to push the anxiety away. I let myself enjoy the moment, celebrating my success with Ryan. We felt a million miles away from the ugliness that had invaded our lives. On the final night, we were at a large awards dinner. The ballroom was buzzing with conversation and laughter. My phone, tucked away in my purse, began to vibrate. I ignored it, but it buzzed again and then a third time. A cold finger of dread traced its way down my spine. I excused myself from the table and pulled out my phone. I had 3 missed calls and a text from Margaret. My hands trembled as I opened the message. "Hazel, there are people moving boxes into your house. A big SUV in the driveway. I think it's your family. Call me." The air left my lungs. The sounds of the elegant ballroom faded into a muffled roar. I showed the phone to Ryan, who had followed me out into the hall. His face went pale. "No," he breathed. "They wouldn't dare, but they would." And they had. My fingers felt clumsy and numb as I opened the app for the security camera I'd installed by the front door after their visit. The live feed loaded, the image illuminated by the bright, motion-activated floodlight. My heart felt like it stopped. There on my screen, in crystal-clear high definition, was my father. He had a crowbar in his hand, and he was jamming it into the frame of my front door. I could hear the sickening crunch and splinter of wood through the phone's speaker. The door burst open. A moment later, Jason appeared, that familiar smirk on his face, and hauled a heavy cardboard box into my house. Then my mother walked in, clutching her purse, her expression a mix of trepidation and triumph. They were seizing my home. A strange, cold calm washed over me, displacing the panic. It was the clarity that comes when the absolute worst thing you can imagine is happening. There was no more uncertainty, no more dread. There was only the cold, hard reality of their actions. "Call the police," Ryan said, his voice tight with anger, already reaching for his own phone. "Wait," I said, my voice steady, almost serene. "One more call first." I found Jason's number and dialed. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with smugness. "Changed your mind already, Hazel?" "What are you doing, Jason?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. He laughed. "Moving in. We gave you a chance to do this the easy way. This is family property. You're being selfish. What are you going to do about it anyway? You're in another state. Try and stop us." "Okay," I said, my voice as cold and quiet as a winter morning. "I will," I ended the call. "Now you can call," I told Ryan. "Tell the 911 dispatcher there is a breaking and entering in progress at 142 Willow Lane. Tell them the homeowner is watching a live video feed and can identify the intruders. Their names are Thomas, Linda, and Jason Thompson." While Ryan made the call, I was already on another app, booking the first flight back home. We left the dinner immediately, rushing back to the hotel in a taxi to throw our belongings into our suitcases. The flight was a red-eye, and I spent the entire time staring out the window into the blackness, not speaking, just letting my cold, calculated anger build. The timid girl they had raised was well and truly gone. They had no idea who they were dealing with now. We landed just before dawn and drove straight from the airport. The rising sun was hidden behind a ceiling of gray, drizzling clouds. As we turned onto my quiet street, I saw them, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 police cars parked in my driveway, painting streaks of color across the wet asphalt. My father was on the porch arguing with 2 officers. My mother was hovering behind him, twisting her hands, while Jason leaned against their SUV, feigning boredom. We pulled in behind them. The moment my father saw me, his face registered shock, then fury. "This is a simple family misunderstanding, officers," he was shouting, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "Our daughter is a very unstable person. We were just worried about the house while she was away." I walked toward them, my phone held firmly in my hand. One of the officers, a woman with a calm, tired face, addressed me. "Are you Hazel Thompson?" "I am," I said, my voice clear and strong. "And those are the people who broke down my door with a crowbar." "It's a lie," my father blustered. "She's being hysterical." I ignored him and spoke directly to the officer. "Family doesn't use a crowbar," I said. I held out my phone and played the video. She watched it in silence. The prying, the splintering wood, the casual way they entered my home. It took less than 30 seconds. The officer's expression hardened. She looked from the phone to my father, her gaze unwavering. "Sir," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You and your family have 30 minutes to remove your belongings and vacate this property. If you are still here when we return, you will be arrested for breaking and entering and felony destruction of property." The arrogant mask fell from my father's face, replaced by stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. Jason's casual posture evaporated. My mother just stared at the ground. Under the watchful eyes of the police, they silently, sullenly, carried their boxes back out of my house and loaded them into their SUV. The rain began to fall a little harder, tapping a gentle rhythm on the cottage roof. The same rhythm I remembered from a lifetime ago. Only this time, the door was open, and I was safe inside, watching them get cast out into the cold. The legal process was swift and decisive. Faced with the undeniable video evidence, my father and Jason pled guilty to lesser charges of trespassing and misdemeanor destruction of property to avoid a felony conviction. They were sentenced to community service, a fine that covered the cost of my new reinforced door, and, most importantly, a permanent restraining order. That piece of paper was more than just a legal document. It was a wall. It was a clear, uncrossable boundary that guaranteed my peace. With them legally and physically removed from my life, a profound quiet settled over the cottage. The lingering anxiety that had been my constant companion for months finally lifted, like a fog burning off in the morning sun. My home was my sanctuary again. That spring, the garden seemed to explode with life, as if it were celebrating. Ryan and I spent our weekends digging in the dirt, planting vegetables and flowers, and feeling the simple, profound joy of nurturing new growth. A few months later, we were married in that same garden, under the ancient, sprawling branches of the oak tree my grandmother had loved. It was a small, perfect ceremony with the handful of people who were our true family. Life became a gentle, happy rhythm of work, love, and home. Then one morning a new joy entered our lives. I was pregnant. The news filled me with a happiness so deep and expansive I felt my heart might burst. Ryan and I began to dream of the future, of turning my office into a nursery, of filling the quiet cottage with the sounds of a new generation. One afternoon, my phone rang. The number was blocked, but I answered it anyway. "Hazel?" a small, hesitant voice said. It was my mother. I was silent for a long moment. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice neutral, devoid of the anger that had once fueled me. "I heard, through the grapevine, that you're expecting," she said, her voice wavering. "Your father doesn't know I'm calling. I wanted to say, I'm proud of you." The words I had once so desperately longed to hear finally came, years too late. They didn't land with the force I would have expected. I realized in that moment that I no longer needed them. My worth wasn't tied to her approval. I had built it myself, but I could hear the lifetime of regret in her voice. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something like pity for her. "Thank you," I said softly. Then I gently ended the call. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden, a hand resting on my stomach. The sky was overcast, and a light rain was beginning to fall, the drops pattering against the glass. The same rain that had once felt like a symbol of my abandonment and despair was now just rain. It was watering the roses. It was nourishing the new life in the soil and the new life inside me. I smiled, a quiet, peaceful smile. "I did it, Grandma," I whispered to the house, to her memory. "I'm home." Thank you for watching Hazel's story. If you were inspired by her journey from betrayal to triumph, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.